Hi, I'm Mark Loux. I'm standing in the Wheat Olympic plots for the 2015 contest. So we're doing two videos, one to walk through the undergraduate plots that were in the contest really quickly, and then one to walk through the graduate plots and give you a little bit of explanation, quick and dirty, about what you're looking for there and what the rationale was in identifying some of these plots. So we'll just walk through. They're not in order. We're just kind of walking down the alley here and hitting them as we come to them. So the first one here is number 9, which was clethodim, an ACCase inhibitor. It's the only plot out here that killed all the grass, and you can see the skeleton, so you know it's post-emergence. Left all the broadleaf, so it was a little bit confusing because we had water standing on it for a while before the contest, so you've got some mud on some of the broadleaves, and the water actually killed some of them. So it's a little bit confusing, but it's the only plot out here that really looks like an ACCase inhibitor. Number 10 is paraquat. We had paraquat out here along with Liberty or glufosinate and glyphosate, and those can be tough to tell apart. The paraquat here, you do see, I think, possibly some symptomology on the lower corn leaves. There's not a lot of, at this time, other real paraquat symptomology. You know it's a non-selective herbicide, so you're trying to select it from the other ones. And when you get to the glyphosate plot, it has canola in it, which is obviously Roundup Ready canola. And if you look at the glufosinate plot, it has some corn that wasn't completely killed. It's a little bit tougher to tell now than it was a week ago, but it has a little bit of white down in it. So, but those can be tough to tell apart. And we had a couple of ALS inhibitors on the test, and both of them do show some symptomology. So this is number 1, which is imazethapyr or Pursuit. So it's site 2 ALS inhibitor. There is some symptomology out here. It is a fairly typical Pursuit spectrum. Pursuit post-emergence can injure corn. It will take out a lot of grasses. It's pretty effective on a lot of grasses. Safe on the soybeans. It's not necessarily great on giant ragweed. And then Pursuit does have a label on alfalfa, so you see the alfalfa surviving back there. Number 3 is atrazine. And if you walk through the screen and use some process of elimination, both the atrazine and the metribuzin had a lot of activity in this screen. A lot of times in this contest, the atrazine does have a lot of activity and leaves just the corn and sorghum, which is essentially what it did here with a few weeds and especially grasses coming up now at this time. And it was applied pre-emergence, and it did leave some of the soybeans, and that's pretty typical. Atrazine is hard on soybeans, but doesn't necessarily kill them all. So that's a fairly typical but pretty active atrazine plot. The similar plot was the metribuzin, which left more of the soybeans, of course, but also left the alfalfa if you were trying to do it by process of elimination, whereas the atrazine plot killed the alfalfa. Number 8, right next to it, is tembatrione, an HPPD inhibitor. This actually showed way more symptomology the week before the contest. So if you're looking around in here, we had mesotrione and also tembatrione, and the difference is that the tembatrione had more activity on grasses. You can still see the white symptomology in here. You can tell it's post-emergence. So your main problem at that point was separating it from the mesotrione, and the mesotrione left a lot of the grasses, really. So that's your key difference. Across the aisle here is 2,4-D. Now we had in the whole area, we had dicamba 2,4-D and clopyralid, which are all growth regulators. On the test, we had 2,4-D and clopyralid. There's not in this 2,4-D plot actually a lot of symptomology at this point. The broadleaves are more or less gone, and it left all the grasses. So you know it's something that's very active on broadleaves. You do see in the grasses, and growth regulators do this, 2,4-D does this flattened stem and sort of the branching out at the bottom where they're kind of doing that. So that could give you a clue. But you had to do some process of elimination to get here, I think, and there's not really any great, at this point, when we had the contest, not a lot of great growth regulator symptomology in there. The clopyralid is the next one, and you do see some symptomology in here. Twisting here, it's actually not as twisted up again as it was closer to application, but you can see the twisting, but you see it generally left more. Clopyralid has a much more narrow spectrum than either dicamba or 2,4-D, so it's very good on composites. Took out the soybeans effectively and left like the pigweed and the taller lamb's quarter, which is pretty typical for it. But you do see symptomology there, and then you really knew it wasn't quite as broad spectrum as 2,4-D or dicamba typically are. Number 5 was pre-emergence applied flumioxazin, a PPO inhibitor, site 14. This is maybe a hair active for flumioxazin, but it has a label on corn. When it's applied at the time of corn planting or just after, it can injure corn. That label calls for it to be applied before. Safe on beans It had activity on some of the grasses. It's typically pretty good on small seeded broadleaf weeds and can leave like the larger seeded, so you can see the sunflower surviving there. So among the pre-herbicides, I think that's that we had in here, I think that was not that difficult to tell, but you definitely had to know spectrum of control on that. There's really not symptomology there. Number 7 is another ALS inhibitor, mesosulfuron, which is Osprey, a wheat herbicide. Unfortunately, the wheat didn't come up in this screen, so that was probably a limiting factor for this. You can see ALS symptoms, and it's one of the plots that if you look closely, you can see sort of the typical ALS symptom on soybeans. So they're really hammered. Most of them are close to dead, and you've got that brown venation and some of that. And if you walk back through there, you can actually see some other ALS symptoms on some of these weeds. So then you're just trying to sort out some of that yellowing and a little bit of the distortion that can happen. You're trying to sort out spectrum of control. Osprey is not a tremendous broadleaf herbicide, but as you can see in the plot here, it did take out a number of them. So you had to know your spectrum of control pretty well on that. And here in Ohio, we don't really use Osprey much, so it was not something we were familiar with. And number 4 was glyphosate. And as I mentioned, you know, the glyphosate and the paraquat and the glufosinate all were very active. The giveaway here was the canola, which was Roundup Ready canola. So there's your giveaway for glyphosate. A week earlier, you would have seen on the edge of this plot in the corn, it either died or outgrew it, but if you look on the edge, which is one of the, again, the other things you can do in this screen when you're trying to ID symptomology, if you have plants that are gone or really close to dead, sometimes you can see where the plants on the edge got a quarter or a half a dose, some of the symptomology still. And you could in this plot at one time, but it wasn't terribly helpful when we had the contest.